All right, let's dive into one of the most defining and honestly contradictory times in American history, the mid 19th century. This was an era of incredible growth, but also devastating conflict. And it really forces us to ask a tough question.
So which was it? Was this an age of incredible American progress? Or was the country literally ripping itself in two at the seams? That's the core tension we're going to unpack today. A conflict that didn't just define that era, but in a lot of ways is still echoing today.
So, to understand what happened, we've got to go back to the 1840s. There was this really powerful, incredibly optimistic idea that just swept across the nation. This feeling of a grand destiny that was just waiting to be claimed. In an 1845, a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan gave it a name, Manifest Destiny. He basically argued that it was America's obvious, God-given mission to expand all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this wasn't just a land grab, you know? In their eyes, it was a crusade to spread democracy and liberty. It was this vision of inevitable, righteous progress. But here's the twist. Fulfilling that grand destiny actually exposed a fatal flaw, a deep crack running right through the foundation of the country. Because with every single new mile of territory, America was forced to confront a question it could no longer avoid. That tension just boiled over with something called the Compromise of 1850. See, as the U.S. got all this new land, like California, the big, unavoidable question was, will these new places be free, or will they have slavery? They tried to paper over the cracks with this compromise, but man, that piece was incredibly fragile. And this right here gets to the absolute heart of the conflict. Southern leaders were terrified of California joining the Union as a free state. And why? Well, it was all about power. It would have completely shattered the delicate balance in the Senate, where free and slave states were tied. And because of the gold rush, California got to skip being a territory and just applied for statehood with an anti-slavery constitution. For the South, this wasn't just losing one vote in the Senate, it was a sign of things to come. It felt like a direct threat to their entire way of life. So with political deals like the Compromise of 1850 clearly failing, the whole mess moved to the highest court in the land. The hope, or maybe the desperation, was that the Supreme Court could finally settle this issue for good. Instead, their decision basically threw gasoline on a raging fire. And this all came down to the case of one man, Dred Scott. He was an enslaved man who had sued for his freedom. But the court's ruling was going to be about so much more than just his fate. It was an attempt to settle the single most divisive issue in America once and for all. Now, this is where it gets really interesting when you look at the different perspectives. The Supreme Court's goal was to completely crush the anti-slavery movement. They did this by ruling that African Americans had no rights as citizens, period. But then, look at the view from the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He saw this absolutely horrific ruling not as the end, but as the beginning of the end. I mean, Douglas's insight here is just incredible. He basically argued that by making such a hateful, extreme ruling, the court had completely overplayed its hand. He predicted it wouldn't crush the abolitionist cause. No way. Instead, it would wake up the rest of the nation to just how evil slavery truly was, and energize the fight against it. He saw it as a painful but necessary step toward the ultimate victory. And that fight, well, it was coming. The failure of political compromises and the national outrage over the Dred Scott decision led straight into the Civil War. But what's so important is that the purpose of that war started to change, transforming the very definition of what the United States was supposed to be. You can hear this change perfectly in Abraham Lincoln's own words, right after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Suddenly, the war wasn't just about holding the country together anymore. It had become a fight to redefine the nation itself, to create a union of the free. Lincoln really lays out the new mission right here. Yeah, goal number one was still to preserve the Union, but now that mission was tangled up with something much bigger, upholding human rights and, critically, putting a final, definite end to the power of slavery. That is a massive shift in the nation's purpose. So this brings us all the way back to our original question. After all this conflict, this division, this transformation, can we really call this an era of progress? So how do we weigh it all? As you can see, it's just full of contradictions. On the one hand, you've got the incredible progress of continental expansion. But on the other, that very expansion created the deep divisions over slavery.
You have the redefinition of the Union around freedom, but it came at the cost of a horrific civil war. And you have the amazing moral victory of the Emancipation Proclamation, standing in stark contrast to the Supreme Court trying to strip away human rights entirely.
And that leaves us with a really challenging thought. Is national progress ever a simple straight line forward? Or, as this whole era seems to suggest, is it something that's forged in crisis, born from deep contradiction, and more often than not, paid for with incredible sacrifice? The mid-19th century shows us that sometimes a nation has to tear itself apart before it can be rebuilt into something stronger. And that is definitely something to think about.